Hi there, I'm Sam Carter, Managing Director of Int-Arb, Arbitrators and Mediators. This is the second of our webinar series, which will be covering aviation and travel. To set the scene, the industries most directly and immediately affected by COVID-19 is the aviation and travel industries, as borders were shut and lockdowns across the world followed. Lufthansa announced that it was burning through 1 million an hour and flying just 1% of its usual passenger numbers. It also furloughed 90 of its 135,000 employees. This is but one of the world's estimated 800 commercial airlines globally. The trade body LATA predicted a 48% fall in traffic this year, and if it proves correct, at least 7 years of airline passenger traffic growth would be wiped out in 2020, according to consultancy Sirium. The value of global tourism in 2019 is valued at approximately 9 trillion annually. The sales revenue of Expedia Group was 99 billion in 2018. It has now come to a complete standstill as hotels and restaurants have closed, tours are no longer possible because of lockdowns and tourist sites have closed. The scale of the pandemic's effect on aviation travel is therefore enormous and will lead to insolvencies, mass employee terminations and loss of the largest contributor to the world's GDP. Our panel of industry experts today will discuss what steps can be taken by companies in these industries to assist in mitigating some of its impact. I now turn it over to Wolf von Kumberg, one of our Int-Arb mediators and arbitrators. Wolf spent nearly 30 years as in-house counsel in the aviation and aerospace industries and has a good understanding of the issues they are now facing. Wolf, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sam. And as Sam says, I spent nearly 30 years in the aerospace industry and looking at what's happening to some of the largest companies in that industry at the moment, looking at how they are currently struggling for survival. You can well see how smaller companies in both the aviation and travel industry are currently suffering. And what we're really trying to do here with this webinar is to set out a framework whereby possibly some of those issues, if not many of them, might be resolved to the benefit of all parties. So it's my pleasure today to introduce a group of panelists who are very well experienced and knowledgeable, both in the aviation and in the travel industries. We have with us today Jane Player, Brian Courtney Stamp, and Anna Antolitu, who will all have a view of what is currently happening and how we might be able to assist. If we could perhaps start with you, Anna, and maybe you could just give us a bit of an overview of how you see what's happening in the aviation industry affecting not only the airlines, but perhaps also some of the other suppliers and companies that are involved in that industry. The UK government is currently looking at a 14-day quarantine being imposed on travelers into the UK. That in particular is extremely painful to the aviation industry. What's your view, Anna?
Thank you very much, Wolf. The aviation industry has been hugely affected, as Sam has said, and it's not just the airlines; it is all of the other parties and all of the other players in the sector. From an obvious perspective, there is a complete lack of revenue at the moment, so money is just not coming in. So from a cash flow perspective, they still are bound by a number of their contractual obligations. So things like lease rental payments haven't stopped. A lot of the lessors are being commercial, and a lot of lessors we're seeing are giving lease deferrals, waivers of certain obligations, etc. And so there is a sort of commerciality that is coming through in the industry looking to support each other. And I think that plays very well to proposed mediation in particular, and where there are real disputes to arbitration, where mediation isn't able to reach a resolution. the issues that are coming out are a real range of things. So everything from having to reimburse passengers under Regulation 261 of 2004, that beloved not EU regulation that is the bane of most airlines day to day. It has become even more of a problem now with COVID-19 and with the complete lack of funding that they have. So they're having, problem with no passengers booking, having to refund the passengers who have booked, no real end in sight. And if this 14-day sort of quarantine period is applied across the board and there are no exemptions, and they are now looking at exemptions, they're looking at potential air bridges with certain jurisdictions. So for example, certain jurisdictions that have handled the COVID-19 situation quite well and are seen to pose a limited risk to the UK. So countries like Greece that have zero cases, New Zealand, etc. There are potential air bridges between the UK and those jurisdictions. So as I mentioned earlier, from a lease perspective, so the airlines are getting no money in, and a lot of them are defaulting or potentially going to default on their leases. The payment provisions under most standard leases are, it's known as come hell or high water, as you'll be fully familiar with. So there is very, very limited scope to actually not pay. So completely stuck between a rock and a hard place. That has then a knock-on effect on the travel sector, in terms of they are not refunding tour operators and agents who have booked for their customers. In many cases, I'm not saying this is across the board, but in many cases that is unfortunately the case. They are not able to pay lessors. Lessors have therefore a lack in revenue in many cases, or are seeing a real drop in their revenue at least. Airports, complete shutdown in some cases, in many jurisdictions, complete shutdown in others, significant reduction in travelling numbers. And that is not just what they receive in terms of payments from the airlines, but also customer revenue with their duty-free shops, with all of the ancillary services that are offered. And those airlines who are still operating are having to significantly change the way they do business. So either giving their aircraft over to the government in some cases to effect repatriation flights, or completely changing the operation to almost cargo only, or cargo primarily. And again, that is having a dramatic effect. There are all sorts of safety implications, all sorts of sort of licensing and regulatory implications on that. And the industry as a whole has never, ever seen anything like this. We saw a downturn with SARS, we saw a downturn with post 9/11, but there has never been anything like this. And it is one of the most affected sectors.
Yeah, definitely. And we know that many of the airlines are seeking to cancel orders with the aerospace manufacturers as well. Yep. Question, of course, from a legal perspective, whether they can do that or not. But it's clearly has a major impact on the manufacturers and the huge supply chains that those manufacturers have as well. So you're absolutely right. It's unprecedented all the way through. Do you see, for example, if we took the leasing agreements, aircraft leasing agreements, if there were a process where the leasing companies and the customer could actually negotiate perhaps a resolution, it seems to me, Anna, that would make much more sense than taking back the aircraft, for example.
Absolutely. No lessor really wants to be repossessing an aircraft that they're then going to have to maintain. It's very expensive to maintain an aircraft, particularly when it's not flying. It's very expensive to park it, to sort of ensure that it's then remarketed. There is no market at the moment for remarketing these aircraft, so no lessor really wants to repossess. And no airline wants to be in a position that when the market does pick up, it doesn't have aircraft to service potential business, which will be crucial when the market picks up. So one thing I've been saying to most of my clients, unless a lease is something out of the ordinary. Most leases have very strict payment provisions and very limited force majeure provisions. Frustration of contract in many cases doesn't help. The English law doctrine of frustration we've looked at for a number of clients, and it just doesn't help in many cases. In some limited cases it does, particularly where there are break clauses, but it would really lend itself to mediation, negotiating a sort of commercial deal rather than sticking to the letter of what the contract says, because that is in no one's interest. Even, you know, lessors who think, well, great, I can repossess, that is just being commercially completely unrealistic. And they're also getting themselves a bad reputation. You know, airlines talk to each other. It's a small industry. It's a very close-knit industry. Everyone knows each other. And those lessors who are being difficult and actually trying to stick to the black letter of the contract, and the contracts are incredibly one-sided, they are getting themselves a real reputation amongst the airline fraternity for as being one you don't want to be dealing with in future. And the sector will come out of this. There will be some casualties, but those who survive will not be turning to certain lessors. And these are some of the large lessors as well. I won't name names, but they really want to think commercially how this is affecting their reputation, whether in fact they do want to engage in some kind of structured negotiation or mediation to reach an agreement.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Anna. That was extremely insightful. Bron, perhaps just turning to you now and looking at the travel industry generally, clearly there has been an immense impact here. We've read a lot about refunds and vouchers, and it's all quite confusing. But Bron, perhaps you could clarify some of that for us.
Thanks. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to completely clarify it. Yeah, as you and Anna have said, the travel industry has just been hugely affected in almost every area. It potentially catastrophic. Significant wholesale cancellations of flights, package holidays, and the independently booked accommodation. I come at it from really the angle of the travel insurers, because I've been advising travel insurers for years on various travel insurance matters, and I don't think they've ever seen as many cancellation claims as have now come in. You know, in terms of flights, Anna mentioned, you know, the good old EU regulation 261. You know, cancellation, they're supposed to make a refund within 7 days. Package holidays, the tour operator, where it's cancelled, then there's supposed to be a refund in 14 days. I think we're all finding that, you know, frankly, there's not a lot of money about to make those refunds. There are some businesses who are making refunds and they're making them promptly. In other cases, it's almost impossible, people tell me, to actually get through to an airline or the tour operator to talk to anybody. They're being pushed down a voucher route. It's being made difficult for the individual to try to get a refund. And certainly some of the countries in the European Union and ABTA itself are pressing that the law is actually changed so that vouchers are acceptable. Because at the moment, you know, as the law stands, people are entitled to a refund. ABTA has set up the refund credit note system. It should be straightforward. It gives the individual who accepts that the same financial protection as that individual had when they booked the holiday. The problem is it's not widely known, I think, in the general public, and also some tour operators don't seem to fully understand what they're supposed to be setting out in those refund credit notes. We've got accommodation providers who, you know, people have booked accommodation privately, they've booked it in England, they've booked it in Europe, they've booked a chalet for a ski trip. And in a lot of cases, the accommodation providers are saying, well, we're not giving any refunds, this is a pandemic, it's not our fault. And of course, it is a pandemic, it isn't their fault. But actually, when you look at the contract, very often the customer is due to get their money back. they're not entitled to additional compensation, but very often they should be getting a refund and they're just not getting it. And I think what the travel insurers are finding is that the individuals are making a claim to the travel insurers for cancellation. Travel insurers are saying, well, actually, this isn't covered because you should be getting a refund. And we've got a lot of very unhappy individual consumers who are saying, well, I'm being pushed from pillar to post. Nobody's accepting this. And they need to do something. And then you look wider at it. And as Anna said, you know, money is tight. We want these businesses, we want these airlines, we want these tour operators to have business going forwards, to be in business. So actually, I think this is where businesses do need to talk to each other and realize there is a relationship which hopefully is going to continue, and to work out really the best way of dealing with that. I think that's where some sort of mediation could come in.
Yeah, I think, Bron, relationships in this industry are particularly important because the various actors are interfacing with each other over and over again, and they rely on each other actually for survival. And it seems to me that particularly where there are these types of relationships, mediation is extremely useful. I don't know what you think, but it would make sense to me that as a group, these various industry parties should be getting together and discussing a sensible solution.
I fully agree with you. You know, because I see a lot of consumers who are claiming to their travel insurers and saying, look, can you pay me? I've got a cancellation claim. And, you know, rightly, the travel insurer is saying, well, actually, you should have a refund here. But they're going to try to get the refund and are just being told, no, apply to your travel insurer. I mean, everybody's got an interest in this, and an interest to stay in business, keep your reputation, and move matters forwards.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's actually in line very much with what the government is saying at the moment. The Cabinet Office issued a guidance on responsible contractual behavior on the 7th of May, which is quite interesting to read. And just quoting very briefly from part of it, they say that responsible and fair behavior is strongly encouraged in performing and enforcing contracts where there has been a material impact from COVID-19. So this is very much what the government is asking industry to do. It'll be interesting to see how industry actually reacts to that. And maybe if I could turn to you, Jane, in the context of that guidance, how do you see structured negotiations perhaps proceeding as a platform to try to deal with these legal obligations that Anna and Bron have been talking about?
Wolf, I agree. I mean, the Cabinet Office goes on to say that there's going to be a plethora of disputes afterwards, and that's going to be destructive of good contractual outcomes, and it could effectively be really a disaster for some of these marketplaces, and that's very true for aviation. And we do have an ability to be able to encourage people to look for what they're talking about, these practical, fair and equitable outcomes coming out of responsible behaviours. So how do we enable industries, and particularly the aviation industry, to have those conversations? And it appears to me, and those of us in the mediation world, that actually the mediation facility is something that the industry can take advantage of, and maybe not necessarily call it a mediation because people associate that word with dispute resolution, whereas actually we're much further up the food chain. We're looking at issues that are arising now pre-dispute, where we're saying to industry partners, let's not have a dispute. Let's not rely on our contractual obligations, because that might get you a short-term win, but it will give you a long-term nightmare for all of us. And I love the phrase that Bron uses, that, you know, everybody has an interest in this, in making sure the industry survives. So don't call it mediation, call it a facilitated engagement. Have a platform whereby the industry interested parties, all the stakeholders can come together and try to think through how does this particular chain of supply contract work in this scenario when we're all being squeezed, whether it's through payments, whether it's through obligations, and try to work through something that's actually much, much more practical and workable. And whilst I'm excited that the Cabinet Office is offering out all this guidance, they also very carefully say in that guidance that none of what they say should override contractual obligations. Now, the problem with that is in positional negotiation between lawyers who quite rightly are acting on the best interests of their own clients, they're going to be having what I would call positional negotiation. And positional negotiation achieves only one thing: it's an argument, and it's a squeeze, and it's a negotiation. And the best negotiators, and there are many, many within industry and external lawyers, will only achieve a certain outcome based on the contract, just like a court could, just like an arbitrator could. They're restricted by whatever the CPR will say to the court, or the obligations under the arbitration agreement will give to the arbitrator. Contrast that to a mediation scenario or a facilitated engagement scenario, whereby a third party independent person can listen confidentially in a safe environment to those parties who are worried and scared, to work out what they really need to achieve survival or success, whichever it might be, and listen to all those interested parties and try to work with them, again, in this safe environment of the without prejudice of the confidentiality of that setup, to find a path through this. It might just be a short-term path. It might be a freeze of particular obligations. It might be a pause period in any particular milestones in terms of the supply chain, just so that people can trade through it. Because we know that by June, July, certain countries are going to be open for business again. We are going to start to get hotels, travel industry, aviation, bookings back slowly but surely. And everybody's being affected by this. You know, you talked about the aerospace world. We've heard today about Rolls-Royce making huge redundancies. Just so we've also heard Uber today announcing huge job losses, because even on the taxi world, they've been affected by it. So there's nobody that's coming out of this unscathed. What we need is safe, facilitated engagement now by the parties in the industry to work through a path in the short, medium and long term, so that we all ensure this industry survives.
Thank you, Jane. And just taking what Jane has said, Bron and Anna, it would be interesting to hear from you what you're currently advising clients to do in these situations where perhaps they have a strong legal position, but in fact, the practical situation doesn't allow them to enforce that legal position. Maybe, Bron, if I could start with you, are you advising clients to try to seek to negotiate these differences, perhaps in a mediation type platform?
We are, to some extent. It's quite difficult because in terms of travel insurers, they're dealing with individual claims each time. One of the things that the travel insurers, certainly the ones I'm dealing with, have tried to help their customers is where actually the travel insurer isn't due to make a payment to the customer. It's actually giving some helpful guidance to the customer as to what the customer should do in terms of perhaps approaching, making a complaint. If they don't get that complaint resolved to their satisfaction, then taking the next step, whether it, for example, going to ABTA, to the scheme through ABTA, which I think we're going to talk about in a moment. And looking at it that way, it's quite difficult to see how you can completely mediate a big set of claims. I think, from the travel insurer's point of view, they need to give the best advice to their customers they can, and show that actually they're doing what they should be doing under the policy. Right.
Yeah, I know, I can understand that, Bron. And insurers are in a particular position at the moment, and I think we're probably going to have a webinar on insurance at some point. Anna, on the aviation side and your clients, what's your perspective? If they've got a good legal position, what are you advising them to do at the moment?
in terms of clients enforcing their legal rights, as I said earlier, the legal position is quite difficult. Establishing either frustration of contract from a legal perspective is an incredibly high test to satisfy. It certainly isn't going to be the case that many contracts are legally frustrated. And so, so we're looking then at force majeure. Again, there is that very much depends on what the contract says. And although COVID-19 poses a commercially difficult position from a client perspective, it does not legally prevent them from paying. It doesn't legally prevent them from doing very much. There are exceptions. There are some airlines who, from a government perspective, are prohibited from operating. And airports are closed, etc. But the frustration test is very, very difficult. Also, from a confidentiality perspective, these are ongoing commercial relationships, and the parties to them recognise that every player in the sector is affected. And on that basis, the commercial reality is that you need to deal with your counterparties going forward. These are not negotiations that should become overly aggressive and people really dig their heels in from a legal perspective. I think that there is a real need for commercial reality to come to the fore here, and for parties to have some kind of structured negotiation or mediation to get through issues. And then from a purely practical perspective, the Foreign Process Service Office at the High Court here in the UK, in London, is closed for the foreseeable future. So even if you want to serve proceedings on overseas parties, you simply cannot in many cases. And that is making enforcement of strict legal obligations incredibly difficult. And again, that is driving parties more towards mediation and arbitration, where it's much easier to effect service.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, that's very insightful. And Jane, just turning to the last point that Anna made, with courts in many jurisdictions being closed, or at least partially closed, it not even being possible at the moment to litigate if you wanted to litigate. Much is happening now in the virtual world, and certainly mediations are taking place virtually. I know, Jane, that you yourself have done several of them. And I was wondering if you might just comment on how well the virtual platform for mediation works.
Yes, I mean, as you know, Lord Neuberger and Lord Philip has been encouraging people to resolve disputes more quickly because of the backlog of courts, even when they're open. So Anna's absolutely right that in jurisdictions where the courts are closed, it will be an even bigger problem. And also, of course, the confidentiality point. And I take very much what Bron says in terms of the insurers might, the big claims. But of course, the opposite argument to that is that nobody wants to set precedents at the moment. Nobody wants to be seen to be having decisions in public that could affect a huge number of claims. So actually, we've often seen in the mediation world that insurers and big hotel chains will actually set up schemes to cover some of these disputes and claims, just because they'd rather have confidentially resolved disputes through a mediation scheme than have it a precedent in a decision in court. Now, the online mediation world has just boomed, and there are all sorts of different platforms, including, of course, the IAC platform, which has been a great success, and Zoom and all the others. And they really, really have. I mean, once you get beyond assuring clients and, of course, their lawyers that they are in a safe environment to have the conversations that they would have had in a secure room with you as a mediator, so that they can express what they really want to achieve and what their fears might be in speaking outwardly about what their obligations have been. Zoom and IAC and other platforms have really allowed us to resolve disputes very quickly, very effectively, and at really little cost. And that's been a huge saving. And I've literally spoken to 3 or 4 clients who've said, without being able to resolve our disputes this quickly, this effectively from our own homes, we couldn't have continued with our businesses. So it has been not just effective in a safe environment, but also a hugely psychological relief for a lot of people who've just been almost paralyzed by what COVID has done to their business and their inability to have those one-to-one conversations with their business partners to try to sort something out. The environment of the mediation, or as I've called it, the facilitated engagement conversation, where you have someone who can bring parties together, has been extremely effective. And actually, I think it may well change the path of dispute resolution for the future, even when we trade out of this, because particularly for overseas contracts, for international contracts, the ability to be able to resolve and virtually see each other and get used to that environment without having to do the travel and the management time involved in that is really a way forward for the future.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more with you, Jane. I think that may very well be the future. I think not only for mediation, but even for arbitration, and I know the IAC has worked very hard in putting together a virtual arbitration platform as well that can be utilized. And maybe, Anna, just very briefly talking about arbitration in this particular situation, as you said, with courts being functioning at a lower rate, at least, if not closed completely. It's now a situation where if you do have an arbitration clause, or you can negotiate that after the dispute has arisen, that also allows you to proceed with the dispute. Many of the arbitration institutions have fast track clauses as well, which can really be utilized now. Often those are limited by monetary value, but if the parties agree, they can utilize that process anyway. APTA, for example, has an arbitration scheme which is paper only. So it's documents that are provided to the arbitrator. There is no actual hearing unless the parties request a hearing. So that's another process that could be utilized to quickly come to a resolution here. Anna, what's your view, and what have you seen? Are people taking advantage of these fast track arbitration clauses?
Absolutely. In fact, I was asked just 2 days ago to look into whether we can fast track. There's an arbitration agreement on a particular contract that one of my client has, and they simply need certain things dealt with very, very quickly. There's a particular urgency. I can't give you the details, obviously, but I was asked to look into whether there is any way, and actually the particular institution that the arbitration is going to be sort of under its rules. It does have fast track arbitration, and we are certainly looking at that and advising the client on whether that is a sort of a viable option. It may actually not be. They are quite limited in terms of the fast track option. There are some limitations around them, but they vary from one arbitral institution to another, and certainly faster in most instances than getting the court to do something at this point in time. Our court system in the UK is, England and Wales, it's absolutely phenomenal, but there are limitations, and at the moment the limitations are proving just too much for many clients, and just too slow, given the moving feast that is COVID-19, and the fact that a few months down the line is simply not good enough. We don't have the time to issue proceedings and wait for 14 days for them to file an acknowledgement service and then go through the whole rigmarole. Clients need decisions now. They need to know what their commercial position is now. Financially, how are they protected now? And there's this need for speed again that we haven't seen in quite the same way in the past. So in the last week alone, I've looked into more mediation and arbitration options than I have in the preceding year, just because that is what clients are looking at primarily at the moment.
Right. So I think that really is a message to people that a process can be designed that deals with the situation that they're currently facing. That might include a structured negotiation, a mediation, a fast track arbitration. You could put those together to actually create a process which would be very useful.
It's also an emotional response to the parties agreeing to engage. So psychologically, I find that when parties are just negotiating one-to-one, they dig their heels in because they both rely on their legal position, and very rarely do they really give anything more than lip service to sort of commercial positions. And I've seen that so often, and I've often said to clients, actually, this is not the time to dig your heels in from a legal perspective. I really think you need to look at this commercially now. And obviously it depends on what their position is. But when parties agree to mediate, there is something psychologically that turns a switch that says, right, we've agreed to this process. We're going to engage in this process in good faith. I had a case last year which was multi-party sort of high court litigation, and the parties for the preceding 3 years had engaged in various attempts to negotiate settlements, hadn't agreed to, and finally agreed to mediation. Long story short, at the end of a one-day mediation, a deal was done. And that is because the parties go to mediation with that mindset that they want to do a deal, or they want to at least give it a darn good try. And in doing that, there is a psychological impact, and I think parties are likely to be more successful, frankly.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very true. And Jane, just very briefly, you were a litigator for many years. You are now a mediator. Do you also see that psychological impact that mediation has on parties?
Yes, I mean, I really echo what Anna said. There is something about, and we all play a role, and even the lawyers, you watch that. I mean, we have an absolute obligation as a litigation lawyer to do our best for our client, and of course you're going to fight their corner. But once you've said we will mediate, what you've effectively said is we will park our legal obligations at the door of the mediation just for the today, and we'll come in and we'll listen to the effect our obligations, our demands have had on you, and you do the same to us. We'll respect each other's positions, and we'll have a pragmatic commercial conversation. And even better, the lawyers hand back to the clients the ability to strike a solution. It's a commercial solution that they can live with. They know best what their problem is, and they know best what their solution could be. It actually is a little bit of pain on both sides, but gets them through it. And it's completely that psychological mindset that they put in place on that day that gets them a solution which the court or an arbitrator can't deliver, but which they can use to move on and fight another day. And that's what's so important, I think. And I think we need to encourage that, at least the breadth of thought process, to at least put that into their toolbox to work out whether it might be useful for their particular issue that they're currently facing.
Thank you, Jane. And Sam, maybe if I could turn back to you, and you could talk a little bit about the Int-Arb perspective and how Int-Arb can assist parties to actually access a virtual resolution platform.
Yeah, sure. You know, as you've been discussing during this time and going forwards, ADR is going to be a forum to look at for swift and cost-effective resolution. You know, for the purpose of this discussion, mediation seems to be the most appropriate platform, especially with the court backlog and anticipated court listing delay, which Anna mentioned earlier. Obviously, this new normal virtual mediation works really well. Obviously, we've teamed up with Aviation Online to allow disputes to continue, as you both mentioned earlier. We personally have got a protocol in place which includes the role of the mediator and how it works online, and the mediation and facilitate negotiation framework for resolution. This enables the parties to resolve their disputes in as little time as they agree on, which enables obviously business to continue to operate without the uncertainty of lingering disputes. And this is obviously supported by the virtual platform IAC Online. IAC Online is a secure virtual portal. I know a lot of people are sceptical about doing anything virtual at the moment, but the IAC Online allows easy access to a physically separated private breakout room for each party and mediator to use throughout, in the same way you would be for a physical mediation, which is obviously during this time is essential. Finally, obviously, from my perspective, as the service that we offer, you know, we in the management team talk through and have detailed conversations about the dispute at hand, the logistics and requirements. Every dispute's going to have every dispute's different. But obviously cost is important. So, you know, we also provide a clarity on the cost, not only for the mediator and the framework we've set up, but the cost to use the virtual platform that supports it. In addition, we provide demos, testing, and talk you through how it works from start to finish. Again, going back to how everyone's slightly sceptical about going virtually, we talk through that whole process so that it allows everyone the confidence to sort of continue these disputes virtually rather than putting them back, which again, you've already alluded to, need to be as swift and cost effective as possible. So I'm happy to sort of have those conversations, and talk through the clients and next steps, which may help, the law firms to sort of discuss with their clients what business or direction to take for their business and any looming or pre-disputes that they may have.
Right. Thank you very much, Sam. Well, with that, perhaps we could close this webinar. I'd like to thank everybody for participating. It was extremely insightful, and I wish you a good day.